Oh, hello there, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, the Saturday stream edition. Now, there wasn't one last Saturday. We were having technical errors. Don't know why, but it seems like we're back now. And as some of you know, I love the fact that every Friday, the Midnight Special runs a full episode. They've set up a YouTube channel dating back a couple of years, and every Friday they show a full episode. They're going in sequence from the pilot all the way up to the final one. And right now we're in their second year of existence, 1975. And the most recent episode is one all about Southern rock. It featured Southern rock bands. And of course, 1975 was a great year for Southern rock, as was the entire 1970s. Now, the 70s was a rich decade of music, and it was a particularly rich decade for musical genres that I would call fusion. Now, traditionally, when one talks about fusion, they're referring to sort of jazz rock hybrids, whether Tony Williams' Lifetime, the stuff Miles was doing at the time, Mahavishnu Orchestra, Chick Corea's Return to Forever, Weather Report, Herbie Hancock and his Headhunters, things like that. But fusion goes well beyond any particular jazz rock fusion idiom. As John McLaughlin, in a jazz rock band, said, that fusion is really what happens naturally when musicians communicate with each other across cultures, across eras, across genres. So all music, when it really comes down to it, is a type of fusion. And Southern rock and Southern country rock and whatever various subgenres you want to name is no exception to that rule. Now, why did this musical cross pollination become so prevalent and popular in the 70s? Well, there are several reasons. First of all, it was a golden age for the record industry. And because of that, they took chances on genres that didn't fit easily into boxes. Genres that would have been sort of, oh, that's too far out there in a previous epoch or in a subsequent epoch were embraced. That's one of the reasons. Another reason is what was going on in pop music. And since pop music was invented, things tend to travel in 40-year time spans, or rather, 40-year time spans. So let's look at what happened in the 1960s. In the 1960s, the primary idiom, the primary musical language of pop music shifted. It shifted from that which was derived from jazz and Broadway, which itself, Broadway was very influenced by jazz prior to the 60s. It shifted from that to a pop music derived from rock. Now, obviously, the hardest rock didn't really permeate too much into pop, but a toned down version of rock became pop music. In many cases, rock musicians found themselves at the very top of the pop charts. By the 70s, there was no going back. Rock was the idiom of the popular landscape in the music industry. Now, what was the previous shift before that? The previous shift was in the 1920s. So let's use our abacus to do some counting. So 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So 40 years. So from the 1920s up to the 1960s, jazz derived sounds, jazz derived musical language helped to inform the pop charts, whether it was big band that was influential, whether it was sort of cocktail jazz, whether it was bebop, all of the various elements of jazz influenced pop music, which is why you heard people like Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby and Perry Como and Dean Martin. They were swinging. It was that typical swing, syncopated jazz beat, which underpinned most pop sensibilities between the 20s and the early 60s. Now, what was the main driving force in pop music before the 20s? It was ragtime. And ragtime traces its roots to the 1880s, so 80s, 90s, thousands, tens, 20s, again, 40 years. And what's happened since the 1960s? Well, 60, 70, 80, 90, 2000. What happened in the 2000s? Hip hop derived musical language took over from rock as the primary idiom of the pop music landscape. So here we are in the 70s when rock is the dominant musical idiom in the charts, and all of this fusiony stuff is going on. Now, southern music derived from the south or from southern inspired cultures, has always been a huge part of American and global pop music. So many musical styles derived in the south: R&B, blues, country music, various forms of American folk music that were distinctly Southern, but became influential and popular throughout the world, frankly. So the South has always had a rich cultural history, and music is no exception to this rule. Now, again, why the 70s? Well, people who became the Southern rock stars of the 70s grew up listening to a variety of different kinds of music in the 60s when the music language was changing. So, yep, they were listening to the rock and roll that was king in the 1960s. They were also listening to the country music that was coming out of Nashville, that was coming out of Muscle Shoals, the unique musical scene of Texas, which is never talked about as much as the Nashville scene, but which is also very important. So they were listening to that. They were exposed to jazz because, as an avant garde genre, post bop, hard bop, jazz fusion, jazz was still very much something that people who loved music were into in the 1960s. And when you listen to Southern rock, it's sort of a combination of all of these various things. Not only that, it incorporates blues, it incorporates rhythm and blues, it incorporates the country music of Nashville, the Western music of Texas. It incorporates a lot of jamming and improvisation from jazz. I mean, Charlie Daniels and his fiddle playing, he is every bit as virtuosic and as versatile as someone in the jazz world. The only thing different is some of the harmonic idioms. Now, I've mentioned a few names, so let's talk about some of the most successful Southern rock bands. The most successful of all of them was Leonard Skinner, because they broke through. So they were just a really popular rock band that happened to play in a very Southern style, one which they wore with pride. And then the song "Sweet Home Alabama," about a Southern state, that really put them on the map. They weren't actually from Alabama. They were a band that was formed in Jacksonville, Florida, another part of the South, but there you go. And this set off just a sea of popularity. There was ZZ Top, which, although their hugest moment of fame came in the 80s, they were a Texas rock band. And they were very much influenced by the Tex Mex and Western musical cultures as much as they were influenced by hard rock. Later in the 70s, you had the Dixie Dregs, who were a prog rock, Southern prog rock band. And they really sort of flipped the mask off of the fact that all, or at least most, Southern rock bands were very progressive, in the sense that a lot of it had very complex harmonies and song structure, very much driven by solos. Musical virtuosity was a must. Many of these bands had two drummers. It really was a musician's style of music. There was, of course, the Allman Brothers Band, who was arguably one of the first super successful Southern rock bands that had hit after hit, and that became known for their extended live performances that were heavily based on jamming, which is another interesting thing, because when we think of jam bands, we think of the Grateful Dead and the San Francisco scene, and later on people like Fish and the Seattle scene. But Southern rock, they were jam bands, in the sense that they were bands that were every bit capable and loved to take a basic song structure and just jam on it, sometimes for half an hour at the time. True of the Allman Brothers, true of Leonard Skinner, true of the Marshall Tucker Band, another one of these bands that were very much jazzy in their approach to this quintessentially Southern music. And of course, there's Charlie Daniels, who is a little bit country and a little bit rock and roll, but not at all like the Osmonds. Now, Charlie Daniels was a virtuoso of the fiddle and a great songwriter, and songs like "The South's Gonna Do It Again," "Uneasy Rider," "Devil Went Down to Georgia" played on Southern themes, and it was very provocative and intellectual, the lyrics. It was poetry. And Charlie Daniels had such a wonderful, sort of prolific output of records beginning in the 70s into the 80s. he kept it going in the 90s and early 2000s, but the 70s was the decade of his biggest hits that really put him on the map. And while musical cultures changed a bit between the 70s and 80s, Charlie Daniels was there to document it because Uneasy Rider was a big hit from the early 70s, and then he did a sequel to it in the late 80s, which sort of flipped the narrative on its head. You could say that Kenny Rogers, even though more known as traditional country and Western music, he was someone from Kentucky, which is a northern part of the South, if you will, in terms of culture. But he started off in psychedelic rock. So he very much was part of the overall rock and roll world. And he had a lot of crossover success, even with his more strictly country music. Black Oak, Arkansas, another huge band of the era. The Atlanta rhythm section, very much leaning in to the jazzy sound of things, but still nevertheless being very southern. Blackfoot leaned into the more hard rock aspect of it, also from Jacksonville. Something must have been in the water that they were drinking, but they were, of course, a great hard southern rock band. Now, in terms of what the first Southern rock band is, it's kind of hard to say because it's a genre that has influenced so much music and its antecedents were absolutely everywhere. I would say it's the Allman Brothers Band, even though some people over time have actually said Creedence Clearwater Revival were. Well, they weren't. They were from Northern California, from the Bay Area, and John Fogerty's been part of that California scene all his life. But they did popularize a style of music that sort of was very influenced by the music of the traditional folk music of Louisiana. Some call it swamp music, and so in that sense, you could call them honorary Southern in a way. But in the 80s, a lot of the bands from the 70s kept going. 38 Special began in the 70s, and they continued to go from strength to strength into the 80s. And that led to the formation of Van Zant, a great band whose album from 1985 really took everything that was great about Southern rock, the virtuosity, the attitude, the rebelliousness, the songwriting. It took it into the 80s. And so that Van Zant album from 85, really, really just an excellent album. And it's a style of music that, in many ways, paved the way unintentionally for what then happened in the 90s. Because while Southern music is much more diverse than just country music, which again is played everywhere in the South, but Nashville is the headquarters, if you will, of that style of music. But the country music of Nashville and surrounding areas and the Western music of Texas and surrounding areas led to something that was very interesting that happened in the 90s, and that was the country boom. Now, musicians who either began in country or Western music or had one foot in that have long crossed over into the mainstream. Hank Williams was someone whose name was known to pop music listeners. People like Glenn Campbell, possibly the earliest, most famous crossover artist, who began as a session musician and a guy involved in the country scene, but became everyone's favorite pop star, who even started singing the sort of semi psychedelic pop songwriting of Jimmy Webb, who was very influenced by classical music, by jazz, by the rock and roll of the 60s. And so Glenn Campbell was an example of it. Waylon Jennings' name was known to pop audiences, even though he remained in that country style. I mentioned Kenny Rogers earlier. Dolly Parton, perhaps one of the most famous of all. Again, never switched from her country style, but a major crossover artist. But what happened then in the 90s? Well, rather than just crossover artists that were sort of superstars, you had a whole long list of country artists who began to dominate the pop charts in the 90s. And there were several factors that were happening. The 90s was the precipice of the 2000s, both in a literal timeline sense and in a musical sense, because by the 90s, little did we know it at the time, rock and roll as the main idiom of pop music was on its way out. Hip hop was becoming dominant, but almost as big as the hip hop revolution of the 90s was the fact that you had so many country artists that became true pop stars. Shania Twain and Garth Brooks being examples, Leanne Rimes, Toby Keith, Alan Jackson. So many of these people really first came to prominence in the pop world in that era. And the pop world has really never looked back. And so while rock and roll, traditional rock and roll, hard rock, and prog rock and heavy metal are now, they're not gone by any means, and there's many new great bands playing those genres, but those are not the musical idioms of the pop language world as they once were. So as that started to retreat, and as hip hop became the dominant musical language of pop, country music, much like a scene out of the Dukes of Hazzard, was creeping up on the hip hop world, saying, "Look, there's more than one musical idiom for pop music." And look at Taylor Swift. She's someone that began as someone playing country music, who then became a pop star whose music is infused with the production techniques derived from hip hop. And so how does this fit in with southern rock? Well, southern rock stars of the 70s and the 80s have managed to have a lot of endurance, because even though a lot of the traditional rock that we all came to know and love has faded away, a lot of these bands, all they have to do is, well, now that rock is less in fashion but country is more in fashion than it's ever been, we'll just lean more into the country and the western and less into the rock and the jazz. And because all of these influences were present in Southern rock, it's easy for someone like Charlie Daniels, who in the 70s was leaning into rock, prog rock, jazz rock at times. By the 90s and early 2000s, he was very much leaning into country, playing the country in Western festivals, where he could have got billing at a rock festival in the 70s and did. He was playing rock shows, and then bands that leaned even heavier into the rock side, like Black Oak, Arkansas, and Leonard Skinner and 38 Special. They were playing rock festivals with, the West Coast guys like the Doobie Brothers, English hard rock bands like Black Sabbath, Uriah Heep, Deep Purple, the prog guys like Yes, the East Coast guys like Bruce Springsteen. Again, music in the 70s was very much wide open. It was the generation of individualism. If the 60s was a failed attempt at collectivizing, the 70s was all about individual expression. And in the music world, that was, and in other places, but this is a music show, in the music world, I think that was a really big thing. So Southern rock, Southern country rock, whatever you want to frame it as, it's a real survivor as a genre. And I guess it's that rebellious spirit which weirdly allows it to be very adaptable. And the fact that the culture of the South has always been written into so many types of popular music, that has also helped the genre to be a survivor. I mean, even though we think of things like the electronic blues of Chicago. We think of the great New York jazz scene, probably the best in the world. Jazz originated not in New York, but in the Delta. And likewise with blues. Blues originated in the South, not in Chicago or in Kansas City. And so it really, in many ways, just like all rivers flow to the South, not the Nile, but we're not talking about Egyptian music today. Maybe we'll talk about Egyptian music tomorrow. You never know. But it all flows to the South. And so check out the Midnight Specials YouTube page for the Southern Rock special, which kind of got me thinking about this. And I love all the stuff they do. Not that they need my help. Maybe they do. But check out that YouTube channel. And as always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.